So when I open up to our three guests, I'm just going to be asking them to talk each for about 10 minutes about their own work, and where they're starting from and how they understand their work on and off the page, because there's an awful lot that's off the page. I think Sarah's nodding here, yeah. And also, anything that you guys might have thought from what you heard this morning, what it made you reflect on, how you want to respond, and so that we can find out whether this sort of a conversation between theorists and scholars and practitioners and idiot literary writers is a fruitful one. And with that in mind, I'm going to introduce you to Jonathan Dunn, who translates from Catalan, Spanish, Bulgarian, and Galician, yeah, and the Bible, okay. Has a very, very interesting perspective. And then Sarah Death, who we work together on the Translators Association, and she translates from the Swedish. And George Surtees, who is a kind of a double agent. Would you call yourself a double agent?
Triple, if you like.
Triple agent. Okay. He translates, is a university person and one of, yes.
Completely by mistake.
And translates from the Hungarian. But we'll start with Jonathan. Would you like to stand, or shall I go hide?
I don't know. Are people going to stand?
No, not necessarily.
Can you hear me at the back? Quite easily. I don't need to raise my voice. Is there some kind of system?
Your voice is great. Okay.
Well, I was thinking during that introduction how I attended the Spanish Center for Literary Translation in Tarazona, and I wrote to them beforehand saying that I'd been translating for 25 years. And when I arrived, they were obviously expecting somebody to be about 55, something like that. And actually, I meant that I'd been translating since I was 10. And I still remember the first phrase I translated, Caecilius est pater. Caecilius is father. Caecilius is a father. Caecilius is the father. Cecil is dad, and I was hooked pretty much straight away. And that's really where I consider my translation experience on one level to begin, but then why stop there? Actually, in a way, I felt I had been translating in my mother's womb, surely. The food that I received, the oxygen that came to me in order to breathe. So actually, I probably should have said I'd been translating for another 10 years, 35 years, and they would have expected me to be even older. So I am sometimes a little perplexed when people talk about translation, and I'm expected to feel like Cinderella sitting by the hearth. And actually, in many ways, though I may not look it, I am Cinderella, or translation is Cinderella. We still seem to think of translation as some poorer, second-rate, inferior kind of creativity. And I object to this slightly. And I could even go so far as to say that it seems to me that putting writing, editing, and translating on the same level is not necessarily the case. It was fashionable to talk about the translator as a writer. I think this was meant to raise the profile of the translator, to raise his or her status. But actually, I consider the writer to be a translator who is translating what he has heard, what experiences he has had, what voice is coming to him onto a piece of paper. And I would say, actually, that everything we do is translation. I think translation is the essence of human existence. It is what we are. It is what we are. We are translators. So for me, translation is the big bubble that includes having children, that includes breathing, that includes eating. Surely food comes in my mouth, I digest it, I take meaning or what my body needs, and I expunge the rest. Surely having a child, that most beautiful experience available to a human being, is a form of translation, because life did not begin with me. I didn't invent it. It came through me. And if you look at uncountable and countable nouns, love, for example, love comes through us. And in that sense, again, we are translators. And in the process, we find meaning. Unfortunately, we live in a world that is a little obsessed with countability. What is the difference between an uncountable noun and a countable noun? A countable noun has to have a line around it. It has to be defined. It has to have a border. So God made light. Man makes a light, which is a bulb, which has a line around it, but he's incapable of making light. It's the same with everything we use in our day-to-day existence. Cooking is a wonderful example of translation, but I am incapable of making a carrot. I cannot do it. I can translate it, but I cannot do it. Adam is a very fine example in the Genesis account of creation. God did not ask Adam to make the creatures. He asked him to name them. Name, if you shuffle the letters, spells mean. So in that process, you're finding meaning. You're extracting meaning. And I think that's what we are for. And I think life is a continual learning process whereby we move away from that initial process of creation through the ego, where most of us start, to understanding that life is actually to serve the other. And this for me is one of the finest arguments for the existence of God, because why would all that learning then go to waste? And I don't believe it does. I started am I doing okay on time? How long do I have? I started translating translating in the term that we normally accept translating to me. Like most people, with a dictionary and probably several dictionaries, and working furiously, activity, doing. And the greatest shift that has occurred to me working as a translator is to understand that it is less about doing and more about listening. When you are translating, there is a voice. The voice can sometimes be quite insistent, especially when you are a little stubborn and refuse to change your position. It then becomes a little more insistent. Listen, if you shuffle the letters, spells silent. And in the silence, I think, is where we need to discover the meaning. So I much more regard translation now as a process of listening, and it comes through me, not as activity. And it's very interesting if you look at the auxiliary verbs in the English language, because to talk about the future, we talk about will. To talk about the present perfect, we talk about have. And to talk about the past, or to make a question or a negative in the present, we talk about do. Now, are these not extraordinarily indicative of our attitude to life? Will, my will, of course. Do, activity, which is what the world is obsessed with. And have, because I want to own. And this is where all the world's problems come from. Because as soon as you regard yourself as an author, you're going to draw a line and say, this is mine. line, mine, and then you've got to fight over it. The only auxiliary that exists in the moment is be. It's the one we use to refer to the continuous. What are you doing? Oh, I'm listening. Be is the only one that is in the moment. I used to regard translation as a straight line, a process between the author and the translator, between the text that was due to be translated and the translation, the translated text. And then suddenly I realized there was a third point that was inspiring both the original text and the translation, though for me they're both translations. I think the spirit reinvents the text in a translation. So there's a source, and you actually form a triangle. It's like crossing a river, but the river has a source. This was a great moment for me in translation, because it changed the way I translated. The triangle is the letter A. The other way to move away from the line, which is what we need to do, is to draw another line through it, to cross it out. This is a cross, which implies suffering, but it's also a plus sign. You must lose your life in order to find it. And the third way to move away from the line is actually to turn the line, which is an ego, I in English is a line, into a number. 1 is also a line. But instead of counting up, which the Roman alphabet does, ending with the letter Z, which is 2, you count down, which the Greek alphabet does, ending with omega, 0. These are the 3 ways to move away from the line. And when you do that, you spell alpha and omega. That's maybe enough.
Thank you very much. We agree about more than you think. Sarah.
I feel it's going to be a very sudden gear change, Maureen. But I hope you'll all get something out of it anyway. I haven't really given it a title, but I suppose you could call it From a Practitioner's Desk. I'm also a translator of some 25 years standing, but I am over 55. Because literary translators start late, peak late, and carry on until they drop. So no retirement for me just yet. I have to admit I have never taken any kind of translation studies course. But I don't wear that as a badge of honour, like some of my colleagues who are so determinedly non-academic that they positively boast about it. I like Maureen, I would quite like to have your list of books I should have read and try to fit them in among the other things. I did start out with academic ambitions. I learnt my Swedish at Cambridge in the days when there was still a department there, and then I went to University College to do a PhD on the work of 2 women writers, Fredrika Bremer and Elin Wägner. And then I had a few years at the Centre for Information on Language Teaching before I moved into freelance literary translation, as all the Scandinavian departments in the UK gradually shrank and disappeared, and there was no prospect of any work for me in that sphere. The authors I've translated, I won't list them all, but they include Nobel Prize-winning story weaver extraordinaire Selma Lagerlöf, Pippi Longstocking creator Astrid Lindgren, classics 60s crime writer Per Wahlöö, and philosophical travel writer Sven Lindqvist. And these are works that have been written between 1830 and the present day, really. As a translator, I've worked with editors of many kinds, from the incompetent and uninterested to the excellent. Being well edited is a very bracing experience, and one that I've learnt to appreciate highly, although it doesn't happen all that often. The frustrations of the modern commercial publishing world, it's all got to be new, and quick. the speed at which one is expected to work these days, the lack of time for honing a text, the commercial decisions that bear on everything from commissioning to marketing, they have set their stamp on my work in recent years, sadly. But at the same time, it has been heartening to see the emergence of a proper, what you might call, translation community. I'm sure you would agree, Maureen. Not only through the reinvigoration of bodies such as the Translators Association and the British Centre for Literary Translation, but also in new initiatives like the Emerging Translators Network and in events, well, like this event, and also like the annual Translation Day they now run, the seminar series at the Free Word Centre, and the programme of talks at the wildly successful, I'm not exaggerating there, Literary Translation Centre that's been running at the London Book Fair since 2010. It used to be an absolute desert for translators if you went to the London Book Fair, but now we have a hub and a home, and it's fantastic, and the crowds are such that you just can't get to hear the talks half the time, which is wonderful. My writing, editing and translating all inform each other. I'm not a writer in the sense of writing my own original works of fiction, but of course I am a writer. I write every day. Translating is not only a foreign language and thinking exercise, but also to the highest degree a writing exercise in my own language, and I'm judged by the quality of my written English. I also write as a reviewer and occasionally write articles. I'm also increasingly an editor. Since 2003 I've been the editor of the journal Swedish Book Review. I brought a few copies along there which I'll leave downstairs if anyone wants to take them away. It's a journal funded by the Swedish Arts Council, which introduces Swedish and Finland Swedish literature in English. It's distributed at the London and Frankfurt book fairs and sent to subscribers and publishers worldwide. And we have a website. In this role, my editing often overlaps with mentoring, because part of our brief there is to try to help a new generation of translators from Swedish to get into print and start the process of becoming visible to English language publishers. For the past 2 years, I've also been one of the managing editors of Warwick Press, which is a small press set up in the 1970s, I think, originally at the University of East Anglia, to publish translations from the Nordic languages and also some conference proceedings and critical works. Warwick Press is now based at University College London. I'm often the nominated first editor for fiction titles, well, for a number of the ones mainly from Swedish, but not only. I enjoy editing, and editing other people's texts also makes me better at polishing my own. It induces humility and a certain sense of schizophrenia. I'm paralysed by self-doubt after I've been editing someone else's text, and then I turn to my own current translation in progress. Am I the poacher turned gamekeeper, or can I play both roles at the same time? The overriding sense I get is one of inadequacy. There's a lot been written about the death of editing. It's a very mixed picture in the UK. A lot of publishing houses can't really afford the time to do proper editing. We have copy editors who check facts and generally misunderstand things, but they do play a useful role. What you might call the traditional role of the editor does seem to be dying out. And in that context, I can recommend a very good article, actually, by Rebecca Carter, who used to be an editor at Harville Secker. In 2011, she wrote an article called A World of Editing, which you can find on the Words Without Borders website, wordswithoutborders.org. And it's about her dealings with literary editors in different countries around the world and the different approaches they take to editing. She talked to editors in France, Italy, India, Turkey, Denmark, Holland and Germany, and that gives you a fascinating snapshot of the way things are going in different countries at the moment. An increasing amount of what is being written and published in English in other countries also starts falling to my lot, actually. Translators generally often being asked to check and edit things that have been written in a sort of English. And I do have to do a certain amount of this, although I hate it, actually. I find sometimes I'm involved in book projects in which I may well be the only native English speaker. There are books published in English in Sweden. I've just been involved in one for the Swedish Academy, and before that it was a large coffee table book, thinking man's coffee table book about Strindberg. And I was literally the only English mother tongue speaker, and I was being consulted about all sorts of things which weren't really part of my brief. That's really it about me. I hope it wasn't too prosaic. All these demands on my time seem to be taking me further and further from the actual translating, which is what I would actually prefer to be doing. But for now, the borders of writing, translating and editing are the place I live my life.
Thank you. George?
Well, I didn't even go to university. I went to art school. I was doing sciences doing sciences at A level. Then it switched to art, and I did a degree in fine art as a painter. I started writing. Well, let me take you back a little bit. I'm Hungarian born. We came here as a family in 1956 following the Hungarian uprising, when I was just 8 years and 2 days old. Until that time, I spoke only Hungarian. After that time, I spoke only English, partly because my parents decided that they would try to get their children assimilated as quickly as possible. So actually, I spoke their broken English, and then went on from my fellow school students to speak English and to make English my first language, and I'm not here really Hungarian for about 28 years. But that's a language I actually started with, of which there's a deposit, if you like. I began writing poetry about the age of 18, then came the art school, and I was doing both things. And I'd written 3 books of poetry by 1983, which had been well received and won some prizes. And at that stage, I began to be interested in returning to Hungary. I read a great deal about it. And in 1984, I returned as with an Arts Council grant, and was greeted at the Penn Centre by a number of very eager people who were very nice, and some of them are still friends, who said, you're just, essentially what they said, you're just the person we're looking for, because there's an awful lot of Hungarian literature which we think is very good, and they're quite right about that, but it's mostly translated by people, certainly the poetry, who don't actually speak Hungarian, but have it a literal given to them, and then various glosses in order to help them. But you're an English poet, but you're really Hungarian, so you're the man for the job. And I had 3 absolutely hallucinatory, dizzying weeks in Budapest, which were wonderful, completely changed my life. At the end of which, on the last day, I was asked to translate some poems. And I was in such a state of delight that if they said, could you please do the washing up for the next 10 years, I'd have said, yes, of course. So I said, fine, and they gave me 3 or 4 formal poems, which I was quite happy about, because I was working at that stage quite for me myself, I still do. And I had to go at them. They had a magazine for publishing them. Now, what's interesting about Hungarian, the notion of translating into and out of Hungarian is, of course, everything gets translated into Hungarian. It's an isolated language, as you may, well, not isolated, but essentially in practical terms it is. Finno-Ugrian, possibly in Finland, but, Finns and Hungarians don't understand each other. Hungarians don't understand anybody, really. And nobody understands Hungarians. But the practice was to bring everything in, partly because it is an isolated language. It's surrounded by Teutonic, Romance languages, Slavic languages, and they're all basically at one stage rather hostile powers on the edges of the country. And they tended to translate everything through writers, not through special translators. So they would, it was part of the way that writers made their living. I sometimes thought of translation into Hungarian as a branch of heavy industry. They would take in, and they would ask, if you're a novelist, if you're a poet, what languages do you know? All right, you're doing that. This is under old socialism. So how did a writer make a living? They were on an editorial committee, which paid them something, not very much. Then they translated, that paid them something, not very much. Then they held some other position, and possibly they, I don't know, they washed people's cars in the evening. But it was, everybody had 4 or 5 jobs. So that was a practice over there, and they translate very precisely into form. Where's a caesura in this line? Okay. Where does the alliteration go? Okay, we'll do that. So there was that practice over there. There's not that practice over here. There was relatively little Hungarian poetry that was being translated, and actually not very much fiction either. Good reasons for that are that very few speakers of Hungarian exist who can do that. Even now, at the moment, I would say there are about 9 or 10 people who could do a reasonable fiction translation into English. They're basically in here and in America, maybe 1 or 2 people in Australia. For poetry, I'd say even fewer, 5 or 6. That's an awful lot of literature to be trying to convey. So I said yes, and the poetry started. And then came this extraordinary thing to translate a Hungarian classic verse drama, which is their equivalent of, it is their major verse drama, which is played every year in the National Theatre and so forth. 19th century piece, 1860s, and they actually set me down with an editor. Brilliant editor, very, very good editor, and I kept going back. I went back for longer periods. So, for example, in 1885 I was there for 3 months, 87 for 3 months, 89 for most of the year. And that's when we did most of the work on this thing. So I'd go in there and we'd say, this line is important because that everybody remembers that line, the reference there is to, etc., etc. So you get all of that. Interestingly, I was first asked to produce an actable version of this first drama, but within 2 or 3 weeks they changed their minds and they said, actually I think we'd rather have a literary version, and there's a difference. There's a difference because you need more license for an actable version, in fact, than you need for a literary version. So that took a few years, and I sort of did that. And that was the beginning, if you like, of my downfall, because from then on I've been translating every day practically for 30 years, starting with fiction, and then little by little moving into, starting with poetry and then moving into fiction. Fiction since about 1990-something. So even now I'm behind with the translation as I speak to you. If I were at home, I would be trying to finish this very, very good novel. And they've all been very, very good novels because they've got plenty of novels going spare and they're never translated. So you're always occupied, and like you, I imagine I'd be doing it till the end of my days. Which is not, and this is perhaps what I wanted to, I can give you lots of backgrounds into Hungarian practice, into what happens when you turn it into English. There are certain specific problems. I'll give you 3 examples of specific problems. There are no gendered pronouns in Hungarian, so you don't know who's, so you don't know whether it's a man or a woman talking. I was translating the work of a gay poet for about a year before I discovered he was gay, and it wasn't which is fine, but you do have to then change things.
Yeah.
What else was there? Honorifics. Hungarian before the war was absolutely full of different honorifics. So your class decided what honorific you used. And those are almost impossible to translate directly into English, Your Honor, Your Excellency, or your greatness, your wonder, whatever, you're always trying to find something that would indicate, that be a class indicator. The other problem with pronouns is that there are 4 different ways of saying you in Hungarian. So there's the intimate tu form, and then there's the vu form, but there are 2 forms of vu. One of them is used by master to servant or by policeman to civilian. And there's another one which is used in a very formal sort of way. If you're in a radio show or something like, people use a formal version of vu. And there's this other odd way of doing it, in which you don't actually use the second person at all, in which you have a formula, some like, you know, how are you, Uncle Vincent? The actual way you actually put it is, how is Uncle Vincent pleased to be? Which was how servants addressed masters, and how children address older people, and anybody older is uncle, which is another great problem. So you have this fake struggle saying, there's this lovely form, nuncle, which is used in there, you know. No, you can't do that exactly. The RU problem, the height of the RU problem was actually sex, actually, more. And it was, I was translating a passage in my very first novel, and I wouldn't do it the same way now. I think I kind of fouled it up, really. It's all about a housemaid who's really a very simple person who comes up from the country, who then serves in this middle-class household just after the end of the First World War, just after the failure of the Bolshevik Revolution, just is in days of it, in which nobody knows, should I address you as comrade or should I address you as your excellency? That depends on where's the army, you know? Are they out of the country yet? Are they here? Are they around the next corner? Yeah. So you've got that. Now you've got this rich people and their son, who's this kind of randy young man, and the maid is, you know, a pretty girl, and he's desperate to get her into bed. Of course, she sleeps in a truckle bed in the kitchen, and at a certain point, he goes into the kitchen, and he has to decide what form of pronoun to use. You see, it's serious matters. And he does actually change the form of pronoun use at the point at which he gets into her bed. Translating that is not easy. And the other thing I thought of, because we were having a brief conversation about dialect out there, was I was thinking, I know, Lady Chatterley's Mallers. You know, when he speaks standard English, and then he goes into da, and so forth, and he uses his dialect when talking to Constance. So my mistake was to go into some form of dialect, which was really no go. It doesn't work. I'm sure it's still being used as an example as to what not to do in a translation. But I learned fairly quickly from that. One last thing, which is I started as a poet. I still think I'm a poet who translates. And that's the only way it's going to work for me. In practice, what it means is when I'm translating poetry, you're talking about voice, is that you're learning voices. And you're learning how voices behave. I'm going to be involved in the next panel when I'll say something a bit more vaguely specific about that. Can you be vaguely specific? Well, I don't know. I'll say something about that in the next panel. But learning those voices is part of the... What does one mean by that? You know, I'm among scholars. What does it mean to be learning a voice? It means possibly, if nothing else, when you're reading a poem in this other language, which is now, I'm up to, good conversational level, I can read this stuff, it's fine. I still use a dictionary sometimes. You're looking to see what makes that poem a poem. That is what you're trying to rescue. That is what you're trying to do. Because if the translated thing is not a poem, then it's a gloss. Then it's saying to somebody, imagine that this might be a poem, or imagine, or I'll give you lots of notes which are absolutely fully full of the associational, etc., cultural information, but then it's kind of IKEA, really. You're kind of putting it, you're making your own furniture. No, I've actually got to make furniture. And of course, it's not the right furniture. You're never going to make the right furniture. There isn't such a thing as the right furniture. All you're doing, in fact, if I can drop my metaphor for a second, instead of furniture, if you think of it as I'm establishing a territory. Here's a poem which sounds this way to me. I'm going to try and I'm going to try and interpret it, to read it, and I shall try to give you a reading as a poem. It'll be just one position on the map. With major writers, you get several translations, and then you can begin to triangulate in some way. Even then, you will never find the right thing in the middle. All you'll do is you'll hear a lot of echoes, and that these echoes may not complete, but complement each other in some way. I put poems, translated poems, into my own books. That's how I started. Some publishers liked this, some publishers didn't like it. And I've edited a number of anthologies of poetry and fiction. There's an obligation to Hungarian, which is partly because there's relatively little of it. And it is, insofar as my own limited reading goes, it seems to me a substantial, proper literature which is worth reading. And partly because there are so few of us doing it. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. So we've covered everything from the internal state, which is almost untranslatable, to the widening social and literary role of translators. And I was going to just add, following on from what you said and what John said earlier, that what I'm really interested in trying to understand or describe at the moment is the actual, the state of translation, if you like. And I think Jonathan was coming close to what I'm trying to articulate when talking about that third point and that place. And I think it's probably because I was a novelist for so many years before going into translation that without thinking, and certainly without reflecting, that's where I was trying to go, to the very, the kind of, you could call it the emotional center, but it's something much more profound than that, the very, very center of the piece of work, so that you're not even thinking anymore, what is this for? You go to that place from which you imagine it's coming or whatever. And the way that I get to that place is by listening, and listening and listening and listening, so that getting into the work is the hard part. Once I am hearing those that voice, and I'm in agreement with that voice, then I can the flow can start, and I can carry on.
Can I add a point to that? Yeah, which is that it's a two-way process. You're not a passive listener. As you're translating, you're making text.
Yeah.
And so you kind of feel that it's yours as well. Yeah. And there's an interesting balance, which I was going to mention, between
it's a bit
some...
dangerous, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you find that Don Patterson's book of Machado translations, and Don Patterson, the eyes, Machado. Yeah? No, fair enough. That's an honest enough description. And sort of, there's a kind of range of spectrum of different sort of ways of making the dynamic.
Yeah, and I think we were talking this morning about translation, interpretation, converging, and so I have a particular. I don't think any. I think translations are ephemeral. That any other person could sit down with a completely different interpretation, thinking that they were doing the same thing. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. What I was going to ask the three of you is, following on from that, I have a very strong sense of music, and that's partly because I learned Turkish through listening to Turkish and not understanding a thing, particularly not understanding where words began and ended, for a very good reason, as I later discovered, because they don't. And so understanding what people really meant instead of what they were pretending to me. And it's all in the language, and I'll still, when I go to Turkey, I'm enjoying the sound of the language so much that I'll turn off and I'll stop listening to it the same way I stop listening to lyrics of songs I like, and I'll just be carried by the voice. So how much does music enter into it, Jonathan? You talk about listening, and you talk about a hectoring voice or a agreeing voice, third point. But does music mean, is that in your vocabulary?
There are two things I would say. The first is the idea of being passive. I don't mean it to sound passive at all. And this reminds me a little bit of people's attitude towards a believer. As a believer, some people consider you to be passive, almost to have given in. And actually, I think what belief does, or faith, is make you who you truly are. It makes you much more you than you were before. This is my experience. So it's not a passive thing. As far as music goes, I'm the wrong person to ask, because I have a slight horror of music. For me, it's much more a question of silence. Okay. And so music for me disturbs the silence. And I would much rather listen to the silence than listen to music. And indeed,
So you're a Quaker translator, really?
well, I don't. The page is silence for me.
Okay, that's very good. How about you, Sarah?
Well, I love just to switch off and listen to some Swedish people talking, because it is a very, very musical language. Yeah. But I'm always more concerned with what I'm creating, and so I will often read it out aloud to see if I have got some kind of music to it, if it can be, if it's pronounceable, and if it flows.
And has the same kind of mood.
And mood.
Spirit.
I'm trying to capture the mood. And in terms of listening, I also do a huge amount of listening to the world around me, to the English language and how it's being used and how it's developing.
Mm-hmm.
It's a way of life. It's not really a profession, is it? You're always on the lookout for...
What makes you a translator, because you're doing that?
Yeah. My family say that they're going to put on my tombstone my catchphrase, "That's a good word, I must write it down."
Does music mean anything?
Well, two things.
Yeah.
What I actually have been doing for a number of years has been teaching poetry, creative writing. And what I generally say is the key act of writing poetry is listening. You're listening to the language as you're writing it, and you're waiting. You're not running a steamroller over it. You have to wait and see what comes back. And that is the real, I mean, that sounds more mystical than I intend, but it is an act of really intense, concentrated listening. As to music, Hungarian sounds very different from English, sounds different from most languages. Hungarian has no diphthongs. Hungarian vowels are pure, so in English everybody's all constantly closing their mouth. You don't have to open it very wide. Whereas in Hungarian, your vowels are a, e, o, u, u, u. Pure. And the duration, Hungarian poetry, you can scan it by duration and you can scan it by stress. It's an alternative sort of system. So the difference between and which is actually written differently, is that the umlaut becomes two strokes, and so on. That means your mouth shape is different. It means that you're physically different, and it means that your sense of music is slightly different. It's quite interesting. I was talking on some occasion about Bartók's music, and how and Bartók, but also that kind of staccato-ish sort of drive that you get from the music that he collected is partly, I think, a function of that. There's no dying fall, nor is there quite the explosion. Whereas in England, I remember reading that one very good example of that is a word, the English word intrepid, blam in the middle. The Hungarian for intrepid is rettenhetetlen.
That sounds like Finnish. Sounds like Finnish to me. Yeah.
I did actually try reading Finnish, and actually my pronunciation wasn't bad. I couldn't understand a word, but there was something so quite close in it. So yes, there are distinct musics, and yet that same music, that same sort of system of sound can give you the most beautiful music. Adiendre, dalola tenger, dalola mult. The sea is singing, and so is the past. And that is dreadful. Dalola tenger, dalola mult is a very beautiful, mellifluous sound. When I pronounce Hungarian, it is slightly anglicized the way they can tell I haven't been there I hadn't lived there for a very long time. So I find it quite unnatural to go I'm slightly exaggerating, but that's what happens.
I learned something. Ooh, okay, will you teach us that word, please?
Rettenhetetlen.
Before I open up, I just wanted to ask you one more question. Again, connecting with what we did this morning, what we were talking about this morning. Susan was talking about the centrality of translation, and there's almost everything we do can be understood in a more imaginative way if we bring in the ideas and philosophical questions of translation and so on and so forth. And I think, Sarah, you and I have noticed with surprise just how much fascination there is for translation, how much interest there is, and how many people will come to these things that we organize.
Yes.
And how do you explain that? I think that, in other words, in the real world or in the industry or outside the university world, translation is everywhere, and people are, and translators are involved in every aspect of literary work now and beyond. So, and people seem to want us to be. So how do you understand that?
I don't know. I'm surprised.
Yeah.
It's obviously a very good development.
Yeah.
Almost to the extent that certain translators, probably you among them, are almost personalities in their own right, for good or ill. But
I think we live don't we live in a more multilingual society?
Well, I was going to say that. Is it to do with multilingualism, multiculturalism, also to do with the fact that in the modern arts sphere there is a huge appetite for people who will come up on a stage at a festival or whatever it is and talk about the book? The more the merrier, and if it can be the translator as well, there is an appetite for that.
As I'm also a lowly novelist, I know that those festivals, if you go to talk about your own novel that you've written in English, forget it. Forget it. Whereas if you go and talk about translation, just even in the abstract, you get these big crowds.
Yeah, that's amazing.
So, sometimes I'm wondering it's because we who live in English know that we're doing something really bad. By not learning other languages,
all bad.
Or because at the same time, even though we're all living in English, where there's globalization, and so we're all over the world, and we know that, and we're doing these, as we were talking about this morning, every single negotiation that we do has some aspect of translation, interlingual of no other kind. So we must know that there's something wrong with the way that we've been taught to be. That's a kind of that's one lofty theory I have.
Could be. So we're sort of seeking absolution from the translators who are doing this for us.
Okay. Forgiveness.
Yeah.
Jonathan, did you have anything? Now that you've told me you like silence, I'm almost afraid to ask you.
I think maybe also you get to a point where you're a little bored of what's available to you, and you actually become more interested in the other. In the same way that I think in human life you reach a point where you start to get a little bored with yourself and realise there needs to be a change. And I think translation brings that. I think translation is also part of the healing process for me. We crisscross lines. We're like little spiders. And this is very important so that the scar can slowly disappear and the grass can grow again. And I think this is a wish innate in us.
But to to go to another gear, to paraphrase Sarah, I would say that also as a writer in the kind of very increasingly commercialized Anglophone industry, I read world literature because they don't have to follow those rules. And so they kind of replenish me as a writer. You were going to say something?
Well, only that, 20 years ago it would have been very unlikely that you'd have had Danish and Norwegian thrillers on television.
Yeah.
Yes? So something has clearly sort of moved and changed there.
But on the other hand, 40 years ago, you would have done.
On
People
TV.
were watching subtitled films.
Oh, this will
In
do.
my teens, there were subtitled films on, French and whatever, and then the BBC or whoever decided we couldn't cope with that. And now, surprise, surprise, they've discovered we can, and we relish it.
It's on BBC 4, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes.
This will do it.
But I would just like to agree with you, Jonathan, about how therapeutic translating is. I really miss it when I can't do it for that reason.
Yes. It's like it's a total distraction from anything that's going wrong in your life because you're inside
Yes.
a house that somebody else built for you.
Yes.
Sometimes well, better than other times, yeah. Mariana, do we have any time for questions?
Yes, I think we can take a few more minutes.
Okay,
definitely.
all right.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you for this very inspiring talk. And I have a question about the status of being a translator more than translation, which comes out of Jonathan's presentation there, but also about the status of translation, which, as you said, may be a kind of secondary kind of work, and you have to move away from that. And I think that interest in translation is one step away from that attitude. And when I teach something in translation, not about translation, but in translation, and then talk about translation with students, I have a very good quote from the German romantic poets Novalis' diaries and letters, where he says we have three types of translation. One is a literal translation, or what they call a grammatical translation. And then we have the poetical translation, where you're kind of free to rewrite it. And then we have what we call the mythical translation, by which it means that a text translated is so good or genuine to the language in which it is translated that it stands out on its own. And his example is some translation into German by Homer, but also the Bible. For believers, the Bible in English is not the English Bible, it is the Bible. It stands out. So his conclusion is it's much more difficult to translate than to write your own poetry. So I think for the status that is. But what you made me think of, and I think how you feel about that, is to have a kind of metaphor for the role of a translator, not as a secondary helper. For me, it sounds as if this kind of role of not being passive but receptive, I think that's what I heard from you, is more like a performative artist. A pianist sitting with the score has to turn it into a concert, and he cannot interrupt after every 10th bar and say, here I disagree with Bachhaus' version of Beethoven's sonata. He has to turn it into something without footnotes.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's of course the great difficulty, because you would like to add a footnote explaining your choices, but your choices will have to work like a choice you make when you are performative artists. And I think, would you agree with this kind of, that translation is more being a performative artist than being a kind of accountant of all the meanings in the text and so on? Because I think that will give a very difficult status to translators too. Maybe you also help with the paycheck, I don't know, because you were paid different, much less than Rubinstein or Fernborn would. But I think this performative aspect of translation is what I think is what my young students think, that a translation is a way of performing a text, not just rendering a text. What would you say to that?
Well, I think George was touching on it a little bit earlier, how you do translations differently at different times, don't you? You were referring to a novel that you wouldn't translate in the same way now. And that would, to my mind, seem to confirm a little bit what you're saying, that your performance changes. I think there are other aspects that we haven't touched on. For example, George was referring to translations of poetry being echoes. But I liked what you said about the mythical translation. And I think, I think it is possible to improve. It's certainly possible to correct. I've had a translated novel where somebody was laid siege to who had died 9 months earlier, and I pointed out to the author they couldn't be being laid siege to because they're dead. It's just a historical error. It's
you do have examples.
Possible to make.
Christopher Reid wrote a book called Katharina Brack some years ago, which was the invented poems of an invented foreign Slavic poet. The Hungarian poet Sándor Vörös invented a 19th century woman poet whose works he wrote. There are Patrick, just forgotten Patrick's second name. Sorry?
Patrick McGuinness.
Patrick McGuinness, thank you, David. Yes, who then invented a Romanian poet whose poems are actually in his book, attributed to the Romanian poet, and not try to chase the poet up. The poet didn't exist. So that's kind of mythical.
Yes.
I'd also like to add, when you're talking about should a translation be the thing that a scholar would do with the footnotes and the explanation of the choices and so on. In Turkish, translation of Turkish to English has been more or less, until very recently, owned by scholars, Turkish studies departments, and they are, brilliant at using text to convey the history of the language, or to rebuild the history of the language. And they don't really understand what I mean by literary translation, but we're having a polite conversation. Yes. But they find it a travesty. The whole idea of literary translation, if it's doing anything but the footnote version, is taking extraordinary liberties that cause them physical pain. I'll show you some pictures.
May I just come back to something you were saying earlier about performative, in the sense of a pianist performing a score. I'm not sure that the score works the same way as a text does, because you know what an A flat is and you know what C sharp is, and those are those things. Of course, you can treat them lots of different ways, but it's never. I'm not sure if it's quite as certain in language that you can pinpoint the notes, so to speak. So you're always in the region of a note somewhere, and you're having to make that. But of course, whoever reads your translation is also going to be reading in the region of, because that's what interpretation reading is to some degree. So it's very hard to. I very much like the analogy, but I think that's the difficulty in trying to pin down what this means in the original to the original reader, and that would be.
And the performative artist doesn't work with single notes; they work with relations between notes.
They have to absolutely. Yes.
But when you talk about translation as a performative art, it makes me think of our sister profession, the interpreters, and that is a real performance in the booth, isn't it?
Yeah,
I really do.
I was not thinking of that, but you're right.
I mean, I've talked to different translators who have different. Some are very, very visual. Some like silence. Some like music, and performative is something that helps me a great deal. But what I've learned about what is a translator? A translator is a person for whom no metaphor works long enough. And I think that's
Yeah, but I mean, our profession is very much talked about in terms of metaphors, isn't it? We are the plumbers helping the water flow through the pipes, or we are the pack horses of Europe, or we are the tightrope walkers, or whatever.
The traders.
The traitors also, yes.
We have time for one more question?
Yes.
Yes.
Can I just put one thing in there? But my favourite one is by an Italian writer who said translators are like bumblebees. The laws of physics say with that wingspan, etc., they shouldn't fly. They do it all the time.
Okay. The question next.
Sarah mentioned something about the relationship with editors that can be tricky sometimes. And I was just wondering if all of you could kind of help us understand where you are in the whole process of producing the book as the final product. So when you actually look at the book in the shopping window, in the bookshop window, how much of that final kind of product do you feel you have been listened to produce that, and how much of your idea around that has been kind of redirected into something else? So whether you feel alienation towards that final thing that people read, or how much you feel ownership of it, really.
That's another whole conference, huh?
Yeah. No, I usually do feel a lot of ownership. Sometimes things have been tinkered around with a bit more than I would like, but it's still very largely me. And if we ever got to the point where it wasn't, I think I would take my name off it or publish it under a pseudonym or something.
But it is a very, very long process.
It is,
and
yes.
It's thought out differently in different ways, and it really depends on how much clout you have as a translator. When I first went in, I just assumed that I would be treated like the way I'm treated as a novelist, and I found out no. And I had to fight for my rights.
Didn't I put it once to you?
Okay.
Didn't I put it once to you, Maureen, in a conference that you should have received a Nobel Prize?
Oh, thank you. Yes.
Well, you know,
I accept.
ownership. No, you got mine.
Okay.
But no, it's an interesting thing because without the translation, but at the same time, ownership is very, very hard. Let me come back to a question of editing. Actually, one of the difficulties, if you're working from Hungarian, is who's going to edit you. I don't think, really, apart from that very first play and some of the poems, I've been edited hard enough. I think the whole thing has been something which I think has been very valuable. But I know there are mistakes. And it'd be very nice to have a dialogue with an editor at a certain stage. I don't mean on a line-by-line basis, but quite nice to be able to ring up somebody and say, okay, so what do you reckon here? So in that sense, it's a venture. And you know that, I mean, there's this novelist at the moment called Laszlo Krasznahorkai. There are two of us translating this person, who's very, very good. I translate one half of it, and another person in Germany translates the other. What is it that makes the writer Krasznahorkai? Yes. Let me take a much better example. Max Ewald. Yes. As you know, because Michael Hulse, who's here, translated quite a lot of him, and then afterwards, it changed over. How far are these things? Is the thing that they have in common something that they could possess? Yeah, and I don't. So no, I don't quite feel possession, because I feel at any time, in terms of novels, it's unlikely, because a novel once translated is very unlikely to be translated again within a good number of years.
Yes.
So to some degree, you're in temporary possession, but you're never in full possession. Somebody else could come along, or simply modify the reading of that writer by producing a different translation of a different book, which then changes the...
Can I ask you whether, there's a number of you here who will be able to answer that question. Has anybody, on that point, has anybody ever come up to you, or has a comment ever come back to you as to whether people felt that your voice and the other translator's voice in translating the same author were a problem? You see what I'm saying? You know, if Maureen, in your case with Pamuk, you translated 5 of them, other people have translated others. You were saying, you know, you share authors the same, goes with Lindqvist, etc. Has it ever come back? Has there been any response to this? Because, again, thinking of the performance metaphor, I was thinking, I come from Italy, I come from a dubbing country. And when the dubber of Paul Newman died, suddenly Paul Newman changed the voice. And it was a heck of a shock.
Yeah.
So in that sense, and I know it's not the same, but it's not as marked as that, and it's not, you know, in that sense, also because reading is an intimate event, in a sense, then also our own individual voices as readers are superimposed. It's not as blatant as, oh dear, that's not Paul Newman's voice. But has it that ever happened to you? Have people noticed the switch in voices?
Absolutely. Yeah. The translator before me, we're all friends, by the way, now.
You're making it sound like, you know, like the ex-wives.
Oh, we are. Yeah. And it's also a gender thing. Really gender. Güneli Gün, one of the novelists, as well as a translator, Anglo, Turkish American. So she, when I read those previous novels in translation, I heard a voice like this. You know.
Which is not Orlando, which is quite
And I quite liked the layering of, or sort of the way in which her very high-pitched, very accented kind of English subverted his kind of militarist voice. Other people didn't like it, but yes, Orhan's voice changes all the time. In English and in French, it often changes 4 times a book, because he'll do these quickie, part 1 to this person.
It's a little bit like if you're buying an audio book and you may feel that a certain voice suits a certain author better than another one. But, for example, my colleague Sylvester Mazzarella had translated short stories by Tove Jansson, and they were read on the radio couple of years ago, and I was listening to one, and I thought, that's Sylvester's voice. I can hear him in that. And I can hear my colleagues' voices in their translations when I read them quite often now, which is fascinating. Really.
If you're working with poetry and poets, it is taken for granted that the voice that is heard in a translation is related to a voice, but we sort of know it is not the voice. There's one just interesting example of that marvelous Hungarian poet Ágnes Nemes, who I think was a great 20th century poet. There was a translation existing by her, by an Irish poet, but some of the translations I felt didn't sound like her. I then made another book where certain of the poems sound very, very different to his, because I thought there's SIBE, which is an epigrammatic classical poet, which he didn't see. But there were other poems in which I thought his translation was very good, in which case it was very hard for me to move from it at all, because I thought, this is pretty good. Should I change field to meadow for the sake of it, And then, but there were these different hearings, and then different people. But with poetry, if there's a reasonable reputation there, it's likely to be translated more than once. So kind of we know we live in a world of relativities, but maybe because fiction, a translated work of fiction, has a longer shelf life.
And it is longer.
And
it is much longer.
Yeah. Well, I don't know about shelf life. I had the chance to look again at something I translated 10 years ago because there was going to be a new edition, and I was appalled. I was so ashamed of the younger me. But, I was at that, like you were saying, you produce these things at a certain time and under different conditions, and they come out different. And how can it not be so? It's bound to be so.
Yes. What's the most embarrassing mistake you ever made? You could remember, can't you? Okay, well, I think we've overrun. I know we've overrun.
Only by 5 minutes.
But I really enjoyed this session, and thank you for making it so much fun. Jonathan, Sarah, and George.
Thank you.